So this is one of a series of chats with people who are doing empirical research that's informed and inspired by practice theory in one way or another. And today I'm going to be talking with Elizabeth Shove from Lancaster University about the work she and her colleagues did on infrastructures and practices. So we're going to focus on a study in particular about the arrival of central heating in two locations, in Stocksbridge, a town outside Sheffield, and Stevenage, which is another town not too far from London. And I'm going to find out about the methodological challenges involved in doing that study and organising that around theories of practice. So let me introduce myself first. I'm Elizabeth Shove, the interviewer, and I'm going to be with Elizabeth Shove, the researcher who, as you can see, is out in the field. So, Elizabeth, would you like to start by telling us what this study was about? Sure. The project was part of the Demand Centre, and as such it focused on the relation between changing practices and energy demand. Basically, we wanted to know more about how infrastructures mediate between practices and flows of resources. I think this is important. In practice theoretical terms, infrastructures are really complicated and intriguing. They enable many practices at once. They're networked and extensive, so they're not tied to any one location. And we wanted to design a study that will allow us to see how infrastructures acquired these characteristics, to think about the details of their design and the kind of investment in them and why they were built, where they were built. But we also wanted to see what such arrangements meant for the lives of practices in individuals' homes and for the relations between those practices as well. So both sides of the picture, if you like. Okay, that's fine, that's interesting. But could you say a little bit more? I'd like to know more about practice theory actually. And what was your driving question? So would you say, looking back now, that you were really interested in how social practices change, in how the different practices that infrastructures enable unfold over time? Or was it more a question of how the practices of households and the providers that you talk about were linked through infrastructure? So where was the emphasis on this study, and how did it really connect to practice theory? Well, that's tricky. I think, to be honest, the answer is a bit of both. What we really wanted to do was think about transformation and connection in the same frame. That was our ambition. We wanted to design a case study, pick a site of investigation that would allow us to look in both these different directions at once. And that's why we chose home heating. Well, that's one of the reasons. So most homes in the UK have gas central heating, but this is quite recent. And understanding how gas central heating became normal meant that we could study that in very standardised house types, local authority housing, which is really well documented, although because it's sort of public money, or it's not the private sector anyway, decisions are recorded and documented. And so we could look at the logic of the infrastructural changes, and we could also talk to individuals, talk to households about what happened when they got central heating, as opposed, for example, to the coal fires that went before. And by doing that, the purpose was to follow the changing infrastructure as it related to changes in practices, not once, and not just one practice, but many practices. For example, how were people living in their home? What were they doing in a living room or a bedroom? Were they watching television? What was it like? What was the work of keeping the home comfortable? Okay, so you said you concentrated on the arrival of central heating and on local authority housing, and that makes sense. But I'd like to know more. What did you do then, and how actually was the study organised? Good question. Well, the main reason for selecting Stocksbridge and Stevenage, those were the towns we focused on, was really essentially the quality of the historical archive, and thanks to Anna Carlson-Hislop for doing the work here. So we picked these locations because they had really good records of the debates about alternative heating systems. Well, they were ready and available. Also, in both locations there were standard housing estates with very similar house types. So it's true the properties were older in Stocksbridge. Most of them were built in the 20s and 30s, and they were more recent, mostly built in the 50s and early 60s in Stevenage. But in both of these cases, gas central heating was added later. So we could see that move into these structures. And in both cases, looking through the council archives and such like, we could find references to other relevant shifts. For example, the Clean Air Act applied and was relevant and influential, but also ideas about proper living and comfort that were developing in other countries and contexts. So that was one reason. That's why we looked at those locations. But for us, still, that was only half the story. We also needed to learn about what difference these changes in heating made to the people living in those homes. So we wanted to conduct some oral histories. We wanted to talk with people who'd experienced these changes. But of course, it's not quite as simple as that. So the impact of such a transformation is really different if you're living in the house all the time, if you're retired, or if you're out of work, or if you've got a young family. So we couldn't, as it were, control for everything, but just to limit some of that variation, we decided to try to speak with people who lived in exactly these house types that were documented in the council archive, that lived in them at the point in their lives when they had a young family. So that wasn't much of a limit, but it was something. And then we could figure out how central heating made its way in and amongst the practices that were enacted by those sorts of people living in that type of housing. So that was the plan. So Lenica in Stocksbridge and Nicola in Stevenage, they went out to find people who'd lived in those house types, but who were now of different ages, but who'd kind of experienced living in those settings when they were setting up home. So that wasn't easy. They started off by talking with people involved in the local history society and then snowballed out. And eventually, and after a lot of work, Nick and Lenica were able to kind of catch oral histories from people who were in that similar sort of family situation at the point when central heating was introduced. So these interviewees told us about how that change was experienced, about how they changed their clothing, about their daily routines and so on. So, and that was where we wanted to start. Thanks for that, that's really clear. But I have to say that's a lot of effort involved in sampling and research design. So I'd like to know, was it worth it? What did you learn from putting these different sources together? And in particular, what contribution were you able to make in a practice theoretically informed way? Well, as we hoped, the case allowed us to look in both directions at once, to look at the local authorities and at the practices of the households. And doing that allowed us to identify forms of what we called aggregation. So for an infrastructure to make sense, for the local authority to work with, in this case, gas companies to install quite a big system in many different houses, scale was important. So the fact that it was a local authority, that there were big housing estates, was crucial. That's what made the economics of that side of the transformation add up. But as we've said, that wasn't the only aspect of the transformation we were interested in. There are other kinds of aggregation going on amongst, within and between the practices on the household side. So we learned that as some people got gas central heating, their domestic lives changed, their practices changed. It became normal, for example, for children to entertain their friends in the bedroom or to watch the television in a heated living room. And as that happened, and as the practices of those households rearranged and as new ones took hold, those consequences kind of rippled out, not only across different areas of daily life, but across the population in general. So not having a bedroom that you could be in comfortably in the afternoon or evening or to entertain friends became a problem. So that was the kind of aggregation and the kind of creep that we were interested in, because it was that in the end made central heating irresistible. So you're telling me then that different kinds of scales and thresholds were important. Is that what you're saying? Yes, absolutely. And some people say, like many people say, that practice theory is somehow allergic to matters of scale. But I think what our study showed was quite the opposite. Actually, the volume and aggregation, as I say, on both sides of the equation, on the infrastructural design, the infrastructural availability, but also the impact of infrastructures, or at least their relation with many practices, were critical. And I think that was one of our contributions, pointing that out. Another was that we had to think really hard about what do we mean by comfort. Are we thinking of that as a material element of many practices, or is it a kind of background element, a sort of service that enables other practices to go on? Or is it, of course, also an outcome of practices? I'm not going to say there's one answer, but I think these are not details. These questions raise others about what are meaningful units and connections and methods. So in the end, was all this effort worth it? Yes, I think so. I don't think we would have seen some of these relations if we'd not taken this particular kind of methodological strategy, if we'd not been able to combine the household interviews with the archive material, and if we'd not pinned down moments in this sequence and worked out from those. Okay, well, I'm glad it was worth it. I know researchers don't often talk about things that went wrong or things that didn't work out as you hoped, but seeing as it's you, I'm going to put that question directly. What went wrong? Well, of course, this was an ambitious project and everyone involved will have different ideas about this. For me, looking back, I would say we didn't make much of the chance we had to use the Stocksbridge and Stevenage material together. So in theory, we would have been able to follow something like the Clean Air Act, which in a way came from the outside of these locations, but affected both. But we would be able to see how that filtered through the ways the local authorities responded, given that they're dealing with housing stock of very different histories, given that the populations are a bit different as well. And that would have given us another angle to work with, more perhaps on change over time than scale, but important all the same. So that I think I regret that a bit. I would also say I think we've struggled a bit to explain the novelty of the work, perhaps even to you. Dealing with a familiar topic is always a challenge like this, but what we had to say, especially about the dynamics of aggregation and about how multiple practices relate to heating infrastructures, is I think really relevant for current debates now, for those who are in policy, who are planning to, for example, do away with gas central heating in the UK or promote heat pumps as part of a carbon reduction policy. So we did some talks to government, but I don't think we really had the kind of impact that the power of the story really is about how changes relay and multiply and ripple and aggregate and reinforce each other, how infrastructures and practices connect. Thanks for that. Not everybody's always that honest. But I'd like to end on something a bit more positive. What would you say was the critical methodological achievement? What worked well with your research design? Actually, I think it was the whole design. It was the idea of a total package, not just combining the archive and oral history work, but linking sociologists and historians, and therefore producing something that really was more than the sum of the parts in that sense as well. Well, Elizabeth, thanks very much for joining me, and maybe we'll hear more about some of your work in the future.